Hey guys, welcome back to yet another episode of the alexr.emprende podcast. Today we have another special guest, Katya. She's here with me because we're going to be talking about Cuba and how living in Cuba is as a foreigner. She is a professional writer, and we're going to be talking about her experience about that. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How do you feel?
Good. My first podcast. Sometime in the pandemic, I started to follow you, and I've been interested in what you've done for a while, so I'm happy to be here.
How do you find me?
You know what? I can't remember. I think it was just Instagram, but I think I follow Dr. Kiona, who's a foreigner that spends a lot of time in Cuba. She has her own travel agency, and I think she followed you or she did something with you. I can't remember, and I remember seeing you and following you.
All right. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, so I have here, I want to talk about your experience first.
Sure.
I have tons of questions. So
Ask away.
okay. I love your accent, by the way.
Thank you. Let me know if I'm speaking too British.
No, if I don't understand, say please. Okay, the first question that I have here is what motivates you to move to Cuba, and how was your experience, to be living in Cuba as a foreigner?
That's a big question. So I first came to Cuba in 2017, and I remember it because I flew on my 20th birthday in 2017. So that always sticks in my mind. And I spent a month as a tourist traveling around the island with a few friends. And I'll never forget my first time. Could not believe what I was looking at. It was love at first sight with Cuba.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I had my mouth open, like shocked, because I traveled a lot, but I'd never been to anywhere like Cuba. And it was so strange to me. But at the same time, it felt really familiar, and it felt like I belonged there. And I just knew that this place would have a big impact on my life, which it has because I'm still here. And then I came back in 2019 to study. So I studied at the University of Havana. In the UK, I was studying Latin American studies. So politics, history, culture, cinema, anything to do with Latin America. And as part of my degree, I had to spend a year in Latin America. And I saw that my university had a connection with Havana University. So I thought it was an amazing opportunity. So I lived in Havana in 2019 as a student. Then I'd say a few months into my time as a student, I ended up moving in with a Cuban family in central Havana.
No way.
Yeah. In Los Sitios, which, if you know, is one of the...
I know.
one of the, how do we say it, notorious neighborhoods in central Havana, one of the poorest neighborhoods in central Havana. And I lived with a classic Cuban family with great-grandma, great-grandchildren, dogs, children from the neighborhood coming in and out. And it was the most challenging but most incredible experience of my life. And that cemented my passion for Cuba. And since then, I've been living here, doing various projects. Most recently, I've been working for Lonley Planet. And 5 years later, I'm still here and still loving Cuba, just like the first day.
You go back home and you come back here, or what?
Yeah, I spend most of the year in Cuba, but I normally go home to Europe in the summer. Because I love the UK in the summer. I'm from the UK. And summer in Cuba is not easy.
Yeah.
No. But I'm very lucky that I get to do that. Yeah.
Actually, we're not in summer here, and
yeah, it's hot.
It's hot. Yeah. As a writer, what has been your approach to covering local stories, and what aspects of the Cuban life do you find most fascinating?
I think when I first started living in Cuba, I came without knowing a lot of Spanish, and I moved in with a family who didn't speak
English.
Any English. And that first year living with them and being that immersed in Cuban life was a real challenge. So I took on the role of the observer because I couldn't communicate properly. I couldn't participate properly. And everything coming from a British culture, moving into that type of Cuban culture, everything was strange. Everything was confusing. So I sat back and just spent a long time listening to people, observing, learning how Cubans talk, what they say, their stories. I was a sponge essentially for a year or two before I became more confident and comfortable here. So I kind of was being a writer before and a storyteller before I did it professionally, because I was just taking everything in. So I think Cuban stories speak for themselves. I don't try and tell Cuban stories for them, because I think people have done that enough, and Cubans for a long time haven't been able to have their own voice heard. So I always just try to be the person in the middle, the channel for which Cubans can tell their stories, whether that's as a writer or also as a guide, which I also do here. And any project I have in Cuba, that's always my main aim, that Cubans get the chance to tell their stories from their lips. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Were you shocked when you moved to Cuba and living with the Cuban family? Were you shocked?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Completely, right?
Completely overwhelmed, shy. It's so different. And especially a family like that had so little. So I was, Cubans will be familiar with this, but a foreign audience, maybe not. But I was showering every day with a bucket, blackouts, which are common in Cuba.
Even nowadays.
Yes. Beans and rice with the fried egg on top, very basic food, living in a way that was so different. But I think it's changed me as a person. It's not just given me this special insight into Cuba that a lot of people don't have, but also it's completely changed me as a person. I'm a better person for it. And I think that comes through in everything that I do, all my work
Beautiful.
that I do here. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Normally, most of the clients who come here, they see the contrast in Cuba, but they don't think that way. They think that, hey, Cuba needs to change. But living in Cuba and changing with Cuba, or that Cuba changed you,
yeah,
that's beautiful.
Yeah, for sure. So that's why part of my projects, my mission in Cuba is I want people to see and experience a part of what I've experienced. It's changed me so much that I really want to help that with other people. And I always want Cubans to have the chance to interact with the outside world and tell their stories. But I also want foreigners to be able to come here and have an amazing time, an eye-opening time, and to feel and to leave Cuba feeling that they've been impacted and changed in a way. That's my mission.
Thank you. I want to ask you, how has your experience living in Cuba influenced your professional perspective as a writer?
Again, my professional life wouldn't be anything here if it wasn't for my personal life that I've had.
Even professional?
Huh?
Professional life?
Yeah, so what I do professionally in Cuba wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for my personal life. So my personal life has impacted my professional life so much in the way that I write. I do a lot of travel writing, and I never want to just pick the obvious choice. I always want to show what's different and what's unexpected. That's my emphasis. So I've last year I went with Lonley Planet, and I traveled around the eastern part of Cuba for 6 weeks. And my job was to basically, they said, go off for however long you want, however long you need, and just write about the best things to do, the best people to meet, the best things to see in that area. And I always try to find the hidden things. So of course, there's some things that are touristy or famous for a reason.
Yeah, of course.
Because they're worth going to. But I always try to find something different and unexpected, because I think that's what tourists are looking for. So much of the world is so discovered that I think tourists today, travelers today, are looking to do things that not everybody does. And I think people will also pay quite a lot of money for that as well. They don't want to go where everyone goes. They don't want to take the exact same photo for Instagram that everybody takes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a big appetite for that. And that's how I feel as a traveler as well. That's what I want to see. Yeah.
how now? What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about Cuba, and how do you seek to challenge those stereotypes in your work?
So the first thing I would say is I don't think people know a lot about Cuba in general. Definitely from a European perspective, I'm sure an American perspective too, but Europeans don't know a lot about Cuba. When you ask someone, what do you know about Cuba? They'll say classic cars, salsa, and Fidel Castro. Those are the three. Mm-hmm. And that is a good place to start, I guess. But the thing is that those symbols of Cuba are becoming every day less relevant. Salsa, people still dance salsa, but young people less and less dance salsa. And it's been replaced by other forms of music. Most of my friends in Cuba don't know how to dance salsa.
Do you do?
I do.
Oh, really?
I do. I took classes at the beginning, and I don't have. I can defend myself. I can do it okay. I don't have the same sazon, the same flavor as when a Cuban dances salsa.
It takes time.
But yeah, I can dance salsa, and I love salsa. But that's becoming less relevant. Classic cars, yes, they're still in Cuba, but more and more you're seeing modern cars, modern models on the streets. And then Fidel Castro, with Fidel Castro, he's every day becoming less relevant. And I think more and more Cubans want to put that side of Cuba in the past. So those symbols of Cuba are now becoming stereotypes. And that's not really what Cuba's about anymore. So again, with my work, I try and avoid, of course, those things are relevant and they're important parts of Cuban culture and Cuban history. But at the same time, I try to talk about what's happening with Cuba now. Because the other thing is, the thing you'll often hear, maybe less in the past few years, but definitely a few years ago, is you have to go and visit Cuba before it changes. Mm-hmm. Cuba's suspended in time. And people say that in a very romanticized,
yeah, of course,
glamorous way. And I understand where that comes from, and in a way there is truth to that. But I don't like to say see Cuba now before it changes. I like to say see Cuba now because it's changing, and that's what's interesting. Cuba is changing, and that's exactly why you should go. And also, what country or what human being wants to live in the past? Mm-hmm. Nobody wants that. Cubans don't want that. Cubans want to be considered part of the international world. Cubans are increasingly looking outwards, not inwards. And it's time that Cuba's, moves forward and isn't stuck in the past, because who would want that?
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, part of my job is to teach people the stuff they should know before coming to Cuba.
Yeah.
And I want to have your perspective about that. So traveling to Cuba as a beginner, okay?
Okay.
Why visiting Cuba, first of all?
Yeah, so when you compare Cuba to other destinations in the region, Cuba doesn't have huge, epic Mayan ruins like in Mexico, or crowded, bustling markets of Mexico. It doesn't have huge modern cities of Buenos Aires or Santiago de Chile. It doesn't have the level of luxury that some other Caribbean destinations have, like Barbados or the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands. Cuba doesn't have any of that. It's pretty underdeveloped as a tourism destination still, but it sounds cliche, but what Cuba has is its people. Cuba's people are incredibly special. Cuba's story is so fascinating, epic, and also in some places tragic. And that influences everything here. You see it in every building. You see it in every person, every story that they tell you, everything they tell you. And that's really the magic of Cuba, as well as the culture. For an island that's been very restricted, the amount that Cuba has produced culturally when it comes to music, salsa, rumba, son, dance, ballet, Cuban boxing, sport, Cuban baseball, Cuban rum.
The culture.
The culture, yeah, the Cuban cocktails even. It has so much culturally. So those are the reasons to come to Cuba. If you want to leave Cuba if you want to leave a country feeling inspired and impacted emotionally in all ways, I think I always say that Cuba fills your heart, it warms your heart, and then it also breaks your heart. You'll often come away from Cuba thinking, wow, that experience I had with that person was incredible, but also isn't that sad, or isn't that crazy that still today it's like this? That's why you should come to Cuba.
It's going to be 100% contrast.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's a country of contrast and contradiction. They call it the island of paradoxes. It's everything's a contradiction.
Please give me some suggestions about how to plan your trip to Cuba. What would you say to people like?
A big thing I would say is do your research. Please do your research. It's really surprising to me how many people come, not just to Cuba, but to any country, not having really done any research or reading.
I've said that a lot of times. People don't do that.
A lot of people have come to Cuba and said to me, "Oh, I just turned up," and I can't believe that. And also in Cuba, that's a big mistake.
Yeah,
because Cuba's not like a lot of countries. It's very complicated, and you need to do research on what's the current situation in the country, politically, socially, economically,
and it changes a lot.
It can be difficult because a lot of the information can be out of date. But I do think it's very, very important to do your research. Another thing I would say, and I wouldn't necessarily say this for every destination, but definitely for Cuba, is I think you can really optimize your experience by reaching out to a travel company or a local expert. Because as I said, there's not a lot of readily available information sometimes about Cuba, or the most accurate information about Cuba. And I think speaking to someone who is an expert, a local expert, and knows how Cuba works will make a big difference to your trip. Yeah.
As a first year, why would you say that people don't do that? Because I say the same. Hey, if you want to come to Cuba, do this, and that. People don't do anything.
Yeah.
They just come. They say we don't need that. And actually, some people.
Yeah.
Actually, I got an email saying, "Hey, Alex, what would you recommend me? I don't know. What would you recommend me to do in 7 days?" I mean, I could tell you.
Yeah.
But I don't want to say this, but that's a service that I do provide. I mean,
No.
That's information.
100%.
And people are like, "Oh, you just want to get my money," or "No, I mean, I don't need you. I can go to Cuba." And I say, "You have no idea what you're talking about."
Yeah.
Because I've been delivering like free content for a lot of, I don't know, over 5 years now. And you can go to YouTube. But if you want me to tell you the stuff that you might do right now, if you want to get a good trip, because in Cuba it's complicated, you need to pay.
I think I completely agree with you, and I've had the same. We can talk about this later, I guess, but I recently just started my own travel company, and already I've had a lot of that. People saying, "Oh, I think what it is because people travel so much now." People like to think they're an expert in traveling, and they like to think, "Oh, I don't need anyone. I don't need to go on a group tour. I don't need to get help. I'm an expert traveler because I've been to this country, I've been to that country." And it's like an arrogance. Yeah. And I used to be like that as well. Yeah, because I traveled a lot, and I always hated the idea of having a guide, or I don't know, I always wanted to do things authentically and independently. And I've definitely changed my mind on that living in Cuba, because I think in Cuba, you can have an incredible experience, but it's also quite easy to have a bit of a bad experience because it's so complicated, and you can leave feeling disappointed or frustrated. I think Cuba is one of those destinations where you do need that extra help. And people think, they think of themselves like Anthony Bourdain, like, I'll just turn up and I'll just make these best friends and I'll have this amazing time. And in Cuba, it doesn't quite work like that. So I think you need to put your pride and ego aside. And there's amazing tour agencies and amazing individuals and small companies that have a socially conscious focus and really want to show an authentic Cuba. And I think you can have a lot better experience if you reach out to those companies or reach out to those people because it's easy. It's quite easy to have a disappointing time in Cuba, unfortunately.
Actually, there was a client of mine that she came here and she was, I don't know why, she didn't tell me, but she was deported at the airport.
Oh,
Something with the passport.
right.
And she was like, I hate Cuba. I don't want to come back.
Yeah.
And I was like, do you do this? Do you do that? Do you were looking for this? Blah, blah, blah. No, I thought that Cuba was easier, but it's not like that.
Again, that's lack of research. Or often you can, it's either a lack of research or you can be given incorrect information. But I'm hearing that increasingly that people are coming away. For example, the money situation in Cuba is very complicated and a lot of people aren't doing their research and coming and spending a lot of money or things with the visa or rules they didn't understand they had to follow. Also, the thing is a lot of people want to come and just turn up and I'll meet Cubans. Cubans are so fun and charismatic. I'll just meet a Cuban on the street and we'll become best friends. But the problem in Cuba is there's a big hustling culture because most Cubans are in survival mode all the time.
Thank you.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
So there's a big hustling culture. And so if you just go randomly in the street and you make friends with the first Cuban that comes up to you, you're probably going to get yourself in a bit of a problem because the chances are, not always, but the chances are that Cuban doesn't have the purest intentions and you can end up feeling a bit used, or that Cuban just doesn't really, they claim to know a lot about Cuba, but they don't really, and they just take you to the first bar that they find or a bar because their friend works there. So you end up not really seeing the best of Cuba. So I wouldn't take that approach. I would beforehand get in contact with a local company or a local expert and see what you can do to have the best experience as possible.
The first time that you came, did you do that?
I actually didn't. Funnily enough, I bought the Lonely Planet guide, which also, if you don't have a lot of money, I think to invest in a small tour or an expert service, the Lonely Planet is a really good start. So I read front to back the Lonely Planet, and that was my guide. And I did have a really, really great time.
It helped you
in Cuba. It really helped me. And I was very young. As I said, I turned 20 when on the plane.
You were a baby.
I was a baby. So I'm a different traveler now to how I was before. And I had a great time, but I definitely could have had a better time. There's things I would have done differently. And also 2017 Cuba is very different from 2024 Cuba. It's changed a lot. So
what are some of the lesser known but fascinating places in Cuba that you would recommend to adventurous travelers?
So this is my favorite topic. Yeah. As I said, I just started my own tour company called Cuba Unexplored, which is exactly about that. It's focusing on lesser known, more unexplored parts of Cuba and communities in Cuba. When I was working for Lonely Planet and I went to the east of the island, I was lucky enough to see so many things that I know most, if not all, foreigners have not seen. I did brand new hiking routes I know nobody's ever done. I've gone to small, tiny towns I know very few foreigners have passed through. And I had incredible time. What motivated me to start this company. Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean, but it's very, very, very underdeveloped and underexplored. People tend to stick to the same route of Havana, Vinales, Trinidad, Varadero. But Cuba's a lot bigger than that. That's only one small part of Cuba. Cuba's pretty big. And there's so many other parts of Cuba I love. For example, Camagüey is in the center, right in the center of the country. Camagüey really surprised me when I went. I hadn't really heard anything about it. Camagüey culturally has so much. It has so many art galleries, artisan workshops. It's famous for pottery. It also has a lot of music and a lot of dance. There's a lot of famous ballet schools, contemporary institutions, and has some good food spots and good restaurants as well. So Camagüey, I think, is a hidden gem that a lot of people don't know about. And it's also a beautiful city. I don't know if you've ever been.
Yeah, I've been.
It's beautiful. Then in the east, the Sierra Maestra, the mountains, are stunning. That's in Granma province and Santiago province. I love the mountains there, and the people there are the farmers there are incredible. And then I'd probably say my favorite place in Cuba is Baracoa.
Oh, Alberto told me about that.
Oh, Baracoa is a paradise. And I think the word paradise is used too much, but it really is. It's the furthest east of the island. And for nature, it is spectacular. And it's quite hard to get there.
That was the question that I was about to ask you, because, I mean, how are you going to get people there?
Yeah, so...
it's so far.
It is far, but I definitely think it's worth it. It's also... Baracoa for a long time was very cut off from the rest of the island, very isolated. For quite a while, you could only access it by boat until in the 1960s, a road was built to connect Baracoa with the rest of Cuba. Because of its isolation, it means it's kept a lot of its species endemism. I don't know how to say that. Like it has a lot of very unique species. It's very unspoiled naturally, and it also has kept a lot of its indigenous native culture and traditions that have kind of been lost in the rest of the island. In terms of how to get there, so the east in general is a lot of people don't go to the east because they arrive in Havana, and it is a long drive to get there. But there are direct flights from Europe to the east of Cuba and also from America. Miami does direct flights to Santiago and Holguin, two major cities in the east, I think every day. And I think also some other destinations, I think maybe Mexico does flights. And I know that some countries in Europe do flights. So that's to get you down to the east. Or you can do, if you have more time, you can start in Havana and work your way down, doing stop-offs in Trinidad and Camagüey, and little by little going down. But that's obviously if you have a bit more time.
Yeah.
Baracoa also has an airport that's supposed to be opening soon. It was closed for a while. So I'm hoping that there'll be some more ways to get directly to Baracoa, because normally you have to drive from Santiago to Baracoa, which is a 5-hour drive, a very windy drive up this this road through the mountains, which is actually a beautiful road. But I definitely think Baracoa is 100% worth it if you have a little bit more time in Cuba, because I've never been to anywhere so beautiful, ever.
What particular advice do you have for travelers who want to immerse themselves in Cuban daily life, like you do, and connect with the local community?
Well, again, it goes back to what we were talking about before. You can just improvise and go out and meet people in the street, like, you know. But I think, as I said, you run the risk of not having the best experience and not maybe connecting with the right people, which again, I'll go back to saying collaborating or working, using the services of a local expert or having a small group tour can help you do that in a more... working with someone that has more, how do I say, credentials or credibility, I think it's important to help you do that. But there are things that you can do, that you can observe more local life. For example, something I think everybody should do is go to the Malecon, the sea wall in Havana. That is a really good way to see local life. Every type of Cuban will go to the Malecon. It's a place to hang out. You see young people hanging out there. You see couples on dates. You see families that have gone to the Malecon together. You see fishermen fishing. You see tourists. It's where every type of person goes. And the Malecon at sunset, I think, is my favorite thing to do in Havana, my favorite spot. I think walking in general in Havana is a really good way to see authentic Cuban culture, just get lost walking through the streets. When I first came to Cuba, I was doing so much walking. I think that's a great way to see local life for sure.
What are the best times of the year to visit Cuba in terms of weather and cultural events?
Yeah, so high season in Cuba is from around October, November to March, April.
Right.
And it's high season also because it is the best time. It's slightly cooler. right now it's starting to get hotter. We can feel it right now. Summer in Cuba is lethal. It is really, really hot. So normally, especially November, December, January, February, is a lot cooler, which is a lot better. It's also where the most is going on because it's high season. There is so much going on in Havana, at least in terms of cultural events. At the end of January, you have the Jazz Festival in Havana, which is a huge festival, and there's amazing music on every single day. You also have New Year's, which is a really important celebration in Cuba. And yeah, those times is when the most is going on. There's a lot of live music. There's a lot of interesting events. Recently, there's been quite a lot of fashion shows and things like that of new brands that's starting. So that I think would be the best time to come to Cuba. And yeah, also because of the weather, it being a lot easier to manage.
I love this one. What tips do you have for the travelers who want to explore Cuba on a budget without compromising the quality of the experience?
So a common misconception, as we were talking about misconceptions, is that Cuba is a cheap destination. Cuba, I'm sorry to tell you, is not cheap for many different reasons. That doesn't mean that you can't have more of a backpacker budget time in Cuba, but again, it takes quite a lot of research and preparation and thinking about. Some things in Cuba are cheap. You can get a basic accommodation, which is basic but clean and safe and pleasant for, $15 a night maybe. So that's not too expensive. Drinks in Cuba are always very cheap. You can get very strong mojitos for $1, $2, $3. Things that tend to cost more money, food, going out to restaurants in Cuba is actually a lot more expensive than you'd think. I've never been a big fan. I'm not unlike Alvaro, who came on your podcast last time. He's a big foodie and big into restaurants. I'm not so much into those kinds of restaurants. I prefer in Cuba eating with a family. I love home cooked food in Cuba, which is cheaper and the portions are bigger. And I feel it's a more authentic Cuba. I love Cuban food. So that's a good thing to do on a budget. There are also transport can be a little bit expensive as well. So again, I like walking in Cuba. Walking is a good way to save money and see the city. But I think being aware of the fact that it's not as cheap as you think and being prepared for that and budgeting for that because, you don't want to get a shock.
What is your opinion on the impact of tourism in Cuba, and how do you think sustainable tourism can be balanced with cultural preservation?
Yeah, I love that question because it's a question I ask myself a lot.
Really?
How tourism, to what point tourism can be responsible and sustainable. With my new company, it's something that I want to constantly question because it's a difficult one. Cuba didn't have tourism until not very long ago. Fidel Castro opened Cuba up to tourism in the mid-90s, and he kind of saw it as a necessary evil because Cuba was going through a really difficult economic time. Well, it is now, but it was back then too. And they needed to open Cuba up to tourism to help the economy. And that tourism has massively transformed Cuba and has helped Cuba's economy hugely. So that's really positive. And tourism can be a great tool and a great channel for connecting Cubans and foreigners together, learning from each other. But the problem is that Cuba's also very dependent on tourism. And being too dependent on tourism is not good either.
Of course.
Cuba saw, and this is the same for a lot of different countries, but Cuba saw in the pandemic when tourism left, I mean, has been, and it still is very, very difficult. Cuba's still recuperating. So tourism can be a great thing, but over dependence on tourism is not a good thing. So, but unfortunately, that's what Cuba has at the minute. Cuba hasn't got a lot of other industries, successful industries at the moment. So that's lo que hay. That's what there is.
That's good.
I think picking, if you do go down the route of using a tour company, is looking for ones that try and make a big effort to be socially conscious and responsible. With my company, another reason it's called Cuba Unexplored and why I want to focus on lesser known parts is that the problem is, and this happens in a lot of different countries, is that a tourist route becomes very well exploited. For example, Vinales, which is a few hours from Havana, that's become very touristy. And the problem with that is, one, it loses a sense of authenticity. And secondly, because people are constantly going to the same houses, staying in the same places, going to the same farms, doing the same things, that the money is kind of getting distributed among quite a few people. It's the same owners, it's the same farmers. And so with my company, I'm trying to go to places that really haven't had any tourism, and to kind of diversify and spread the tourists and spread the opportunities around. So that's what I'm really focusing on. But I think it will forever be a work in progress. I'm going to be always learning and trying to educate myself on how to do things more responsibly, how I can feel that what I'm doing is actively helping Cubans that really need it. But I don't have the perfect answer.
Of course.
We're all learning, no?
I mean, there's no perfect answer for Cuba.
No.
There's not.
No.
How do you think that Cuba has changed in the recent years, and what are your hopes for the country's future? You told me that most of the people who come here, they say, hey, come to Cuba now before it changes. And you said, it's come now that it's changing. What do you think about it?
So Cuba has changed a lot in a lot of negative ways, but also some positive ways too. And Cuba's going through a really, really, really hard time. I think any foreigner that comes to Cuba should understand that you're coming and visiting a country in crisis. There's no other way to put it. And I think sometimes people in the industry try to protect tourists from that, or not tell them that, or hide that. But I think every tourist should know that for many different reasons. And so I think you should always have that in your mind when you're traveling in Cuba. At the same time, I'm quite optimistic about Cuba's future. And I think a lot of Cubans don't feel optimistic. And I think it's, in a way, a luxury to be able to be optimistic in some ways, because I can be optimistic because I don't have to, I don't have the same struggles as Cubans do here.
Of course, yeah.
That's just the truth. And so I feel like someone needs to be optimistic, and I do feel optimistic. I think Cuba's going through a very, very difficult time, and there's a lot of big changes that are affecting everybody. But at the same time, the whole world is going through a very strange time. If you put it in more of a global context, post-pandemic, there's a lot of things going on. I think the world in general is going through a difficult time, although Cuba has it particularly bad. But I think we're coming out of the aftermath of the pandemic, and I think things will begin to get better and stabilize. And I think one of the main changes happening in Cuba at the moment, which I think is going to be a positive thing, is the opening up of the private market. Mm-hmm. Before, everybody has said that the government need to be more relaxed and allow private business to flourish more. But now I think there is no other choice. And I think the private sector is going to be growing a lot.
It's helping a lot.
And it is helping a lot. Even in the past year, 2 years, there's a lot of small businesses growing. I think that's an incredible thing for Cuba, and it will continue to do so. I know so many small businesses, whether it's a cafe or a fashion brand or a record label or anything. Whatever it is. And that's the biggest change. Capitalism coming to Cuba, they say. And with that, I'm optimistic, and I want to keep believing in Cuba, and I want to keep seeing what can be done to help things grow and help Cuba get out of being stuck in the past.
I want to ask you some questions about your project, your business, but before going into that, the last question that I have here is the current situation in Cuba that tourists will face, like gas, blackouts, shortage.
Yeah.
How to get over all of that as a tourist?
Yeah. That's difficult. Again, a lot of research. When I have people come to Cuba, I think an important part of being in the travel industry is managing people's expectations. People normally are understanding if they feel prepared or they knew it was happening. Again, that's what happens when you come to Cuba unprepared, is these things come as a shock. Not knowing that there are blackouts in Cuba and all of a sudden getting stuck in a blackout is not fun. But if you're prepared for it, you manage to find... I remember I took a group of tourists down to the east of Cuba in January, an older group of American photographers, and they were briefed and they were told what they might expect. So when a blackout did happen, we sat in the dark in our house and we just drank beers and we spoke. And they kind of, in a weird way, enjoyed it. Obviously, it's not their daily reality that they have to face, but they found a way to ease into it, relax into that, have a beer. Don't worry about it. It will come back on. And if you want an authentic Cuban experience, well, that's it.
Yeah.
When it comes to gas, it's a big problem. I think before I went down to the east to work with Lonely Planet last year, there's a lot of misconceptions, not just about Cuba, but East Cuba. People say it's impossible to get down there. You'll get stuck down there. There's no gas. There's nothing down there. There's a lot of misconceptions about the east of Cuba from other Cubans as well.
Yeah, of course.
Because it's actually an island that's not very connected. But when I went down there, it did, it had a lot of challenges, but Cubans have an amazing way of being able to get around problems. It's, I think, one of the best things about Cubans is there's always a solution. You guys always find a way to have a solution. So if there's tourists down there and tourists need to get from A to B, Cubans will make that happen despite shortages of oil, despite these challenges. And that's what I found when I was there in January. There's a few times that we had to swap transport because the transport broke down. There's a few things that could almost go wrong, but Cubans are so good at finding solutions. So I wouldn't let that put you off coming to Cuba. But you do need to be aware that, again, you're visiting a country in crisis, you're visiting a country that has blackouts, you're visiting a country where you're going to look at a menu and a lot of those things that you want to have aren't on the menu.
They don't have it.
They don't have it. But that's the authentic Cuba experience. Yeah. So if you want that kind of experience, you can go to a resort, not go to Havana, just go to a Varadero or whatever and eat lobster and not really go out of that bubble and not be affected by anything. If that's what you want, okay. That's not how I do things, but if that's what you want. But if you want an authentic Cuba experience, that's part of the deal. So
let's talk about Unexplored. How this business began. Yeah,
so I'm sure Alvaro mentioned it on the podcast you did together. He's my co-founder in the business. We went down together for Lonely Planet. I was doing the writing part, but I really wanted to go with somebody that, one, was Cuban, because although I have spent a long time in Cuba and I think I've integrated a lot into Cuban life, I'm not Cuban.
Yeah.
And it's also about telling Cuban stories and the Cubans telling their own stories. So I wanted to go and do this project with a Cuban. I'd worked with Alvaro on other projects before. He's also one of my closest friends in Cuba.
That is you two both like very together.
Yeah, we're very close. And also I needed help with the logistics, which Alvaro is very, very good at, because I wanted to focus on the editorial, the writing part, going to 6 provinces in the east. So Granma, Santiago, Guantanamo, Holguin, Las Tunas, and Camagüey. Is that 6? Yeah, I think so. And we had the time of our lives. We went to every little town, every site, cultural things, music, food, nature, people. And it was an incredible experience. We both feel so, so, so lucky. But we wanted to use all of that knowledge that we gained and amazing contacts that are doing really interesting things down there. We wanted to build something of our own and be able to have people experience what we experienced. So that's where it all started. So at the moment, the biggest focus will be on the east of the island, although we're not limited just to the east of the island. We'll be offering things everywhere. But again, as I said, the focus is unexplored places, off the beaten track places, for people that are adventurous and want to see the real Cuba, which is a phrase that I don't like particularly because a lot of people say that. Pretty much every company will say, we'll show you the real Cuba. But then you look at their itineraries and everyone's kind of doing the same thing and going to the same places. So we're really trying to do something very different.
That's good. It's already available? Or?
It is. We started, I think, a couple months ago, and we're going to be working at the start with other agencies. But we also have our first offering, which is a food tour, as Alvaro is very big into food, and I am as well. So it's an 9-day trip going across the whole of the east of Cuba. Every day has a different gastronomic theme.
You told me about that.
Yeah.
It's
so
amazing.
Everything from coffee and rum in Santiago to indigenous cuisine in Baracoa to eating like the Mambises, the independence fighters of Cuba in the war with Spain. We go into the mountains where they fought, and we collect ingredients and we cook. Things that are really different, but also have a very educational purpose behind it. So yeah, that's what we're doing. We're going to be offering a lot of different things, cultural tours, as well as doing custom things. So it's very, very, very exciting. I'm very excited. Yeah.
That's really good. We're going to put the links down below, guys, if you want to check it out.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Last but not least, how could people support Cuban people while they travel here?
Very important, very important. Staying in private casas, private homes, or if you want something a bit more luxury, there are private boutique hotels. Interacting with Cuban businesses. Again, there are so many interesting businesses starting up, restaurants, cafes, shops, fashion brands. I think, going private as much as possible is the main message. I've never been a big fan of resorts or big hotel chains. That's, for me, not the best way to see a country. Each to their own, but that's not how I do things. I think engaging with the private market as much as possible.
Same. Anything that you want to mention before we ended up? I mean, it's been amazing having you here.
Thank you. Yeah, we've gone through a lot of different topics. Despite Cuba's problems, despite how confusing Cuba can be, I think it's a place anybody should 100% go to. And I came here 20 years old in 2017, and it's made such a big impact on me that I'm still here, and I plan to be here for a long time. I'd say everyone should be coming to Cuba, and Cuba needs it. Cuba really needs it too. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
No, it was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Do you have any goals for the next few years?
Yeah. So the main thing will be the business, growing the business. And then apart from that, I want to keep on with my writing as well. I want to write for more publications. I know so many people in Cuba now with interesting stories to tell. So I really want to focus on getting those stories out into the world. So those are my two main goals.
Okay. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, if you want to check the links, is going to be down below. And also we did a podcast with Alvaro, and he was talking about the Cuban food, all of that. It was a great podcast, by the way.
It was.
So you can check it out. Links down below as well. Thank you again.
Thanks.
And see you guys in the next episode. Ciao, Bacao.